Today, in Leadership Lessons from High Seas, I want to talk about a very important skill which I learned when I was working on ships, and that's around voyage planning. Voyage planning means planning a voyage to go from one port to another. And it's a very meticulous, very thorough exercise because when you're planning your voyage, you need to make sure you take into account the distance between two ports. You need to take into account the weather conditions, the weather forecast, the ocean currents, how much fuel you are carrying, what type of cargo you're carrying. You need to plan for contingencies and route. So it's a very, very detailed and thorough exercise. And one of the aspects of voyage planning is actually to mark no-go areas on the navigation chart. Now, as the name implies, no-go areas are areas where the ship is not supposed to go. So these could be areas such as shallow waters where there is low depth, areas where there could be ship's wreck, areas where which are unsurveyed, where we don't have enough information about the seabed, or it could be areas where you have rocks or reefs. There could be any of these areas. The whole idea is that these areas are areas where the ship is supposed to avoid. So these areas are very clearly marked on the chart, and so that when you're navigating, you keep a safe distance from these areas. Now, what's the relevance of no-go area in terms of leadership? Because as a leader, you need to set boundaries at workplace for yourself. Those are your no-go areas. What is acceptable to you and what is not? What will you say no to? What is negotiable and what is not negotiable for you? Your no-go areas, your boundaries. And those boundaries can be with respect to time. It could be with respect to the ways of working, behavior, habits. It could be emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, social boundaries, whatever works for you. And setting boundaries actually is a very important aspect of self-awareness as a leader, but it's often ignored. A lot of times you're not aware what boundaries should I set or what is the impact of not having these boundaries in place. And sometimes you may be aware that these are the boundaries I should be ideally setting, but you're hesitant, you're afraid of setting these boundaries or communicating these to people around you. Because sometimes you feel, what will people think about me? Will I be less popular? Will I have a conflict with somebody? So sometimes you hesitate setting up and communicating boundaries. But actually, when you set boundaries at workplace, it gives you a lot of freedom. It gives you space. It gives you a sense of control. And setting boundaries is actually very important for your well-being, for self-care, and for your optimal performance and productivity. Now, what happens when you don't set boundaries? When you don't set boundaries, sometimes it may happen that you end up prioritizing what is important for others rather than prioritizing what is important for you. And that may sometimes leave you frustrated, angry, depressed, stressed out, anxious, because you are doing a lot of what others are expecting you to do rather than what you want to do. Sometimes not having boundaries could create a lot of communication gaps, misunderstanding between teams, or create a lot of friction. And especially when it comes to time boundaries, if your boundaries are not clearly defined and communicated, that may sometimes leave you completely exhausted, completely drained out. Now, setting boundary obviously is based on the principle of reciprocity, because it is not just for your own self. When you set and communicate boundaries, it is also telling people how best to engage with you. And when you expect people to respect your boundaries, you are also expected to honor and respect others' boundaries, because setting boundaries, respecting them, form the cornerstones of a relationship which is based on trust and respect. So, and this obviously concept is applicable to personal life as well, social life, relationships. So make sure that whether it's professional life, personal life, you have clearly identified areas where you need to set boundaries, and you have clearly communicated to people around them. So here's something for you to go back and reflect. Are there certain areas where you have not set boundaries, or do you find setting boundaries difficult? Or are there things which you end up saying yes to where you should ideally be saying no to? And if you want to discuss it further, let's have a conversation. But I hope you enjoyed this analogy between no-go areas on a ship versus setting boundaries at workplace. Do share your feedback and comments. And till then, stay safe, stay healthy. All the best.